Good evening, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to the third lecture of the Ayn Rand Institute's 2003 series. My name is Yaron Brook, and I'm the Executive Director of the Ayn Rand Institute, which is headquartered here in Irvine, California. As many of you know, the Ayn Rand Institute is a non-for-profit organization, and our programs are funded by the private donations from corporations, foundations, but primarily from generous individuals like you throughout the U.S. and around the world. Tonight's lecture has been made possible by these contributions, and with this continued support, we look forward to offering many more lectures in the future. If you enjoy coming to our lecture series and see the value in promoting the Institute's position to an ever wider audience, please consider making a contribution in the back on your way out tonight. With your help, I think we can really have an impact here in Orange County and nationally. Now let me make a few brief announcements before we begin tonight's lecture. At the back of the room, we have information about the Institute's programs, as well as free literature on a number of topics for you to take home and read at your leisure. We have an extensive selection of Ayn Rand's books and other publications available for purchase, including videotapes of previous lectures in this event series, and you can pre-order a videotape of tonight's talk in the back. We are also pleased to announce that the Institute is again offering its evening Introduction to Objectivism course. The course will repeat the sold-out class, which is will be finishing, I think, tomorrow, and we'll meet on Tuesday nights running from May 6th until June 10th. If you're interested, please pick up the information flyer in the back again before you leave tonight. I'd also like to announce that the Institute will be sponsoring a 12-day summer conference here in Southern California beginning on July 5th. The conference is an annual event attended by people from all over the world and is a great learning experience covering many topics. Information on the summer conference is available in the back, and Dr. Leonard Peikoff is our featured speaker at the summer conference this summer. Just one more announcement, and as tomorrow night there will be a debate on the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, who is in the right, between myself and Dr. Mark Levine, an assistant professor in Mideast Studies at UCI. And for information on that debate, where it is and how to get there and so on, you can go to our website at www.aynrand.org. Tonight, our speaker is Dr. Leonard Peikoff. Dr. Peikoff is Ayn Rand's legal and intellectual heir. He was a close associate of Ayn Rand for 30 years, and today is the preeminent spokesman for her philosophy, objectivism. Dr. Peikoff is also the founder of the Ayn Rand Institute and is the author of Objectivism, The Philosophy of Ayn Rand, The Ominous Parallels, and the editor of numerous Ayn Rand anthologies. Tonight's lecture is entitled America versus Americans. Now, at the end of the lecture, I'll be joining Dr. Peikoff to take questions from the audience. So if you have a question at that time, please step up to the mic that's located here in the central aisle. And please, I'll ask this time, limit yourself to questions. Now, following the Q&A, Dr. Peikoff will be doing a book signing in the corner to my left, in the back, near the bookstore where some of his material is available for sale. So with that, ladies and gentlemen, Dr. Leonard Peikoff.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. The subject on everyone's mind the past month is, of course, the news from Iraq. But I'm not bringing you the news tonight. I'm a philosopher by trade, not a journalist or politician. So it's my job to dig under the news reports and identify the basic principles governing our foreign policy and our citizens, the principles and their long-range results on America. So I ask you, if you will, to please put the war in Iraq aside for half an hour, including whatever estimate of it you have, because I want to stand back and gain some perspective on a whole chain of current events and on the public reaction to them. I want to look not just at Iraq, which is only the latest link in the chain, but at the whole picture of America versus the terrorists in the last 19+ months. And I want to start back in the 18th century with about 60 seconds on the founding of America, the greatest country in history. Our founding fathers, champions of the Enlightenment and of individual rights, were not only outraged at the abuses suffered from England, they knew that they were absolutely right to be outraged. So they had the immense self-confidence and the moral certainty necessary to declare war against the most powerful empire in the world. The Americans of that era were innocent and benevolent. They were uplifted by the prospect of breaking with the corruption of the past and starting a rational country for the first time in history. And they knew what had always been the top enemy of their new rational world. As Elihu Palmer said, "At last men have escaped from, quote, the long and doleful night of religion with its frenzy," these are his words, "its fanaticism, its mad enthusiasm," unquote. Now on 9/11/2001, the long and doleful night once more entered the scene of Western history. The frenzy, fanaticism, and mad enthusiasm finally went to war against America with the declared purpose of wiping out everything our country stands for. On some level, President Bush understood the uniqueness of 9/11. He has compared it validly to the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941. But 9/11, he has suggested, is worse. And even in purely quantitative terms, he is right about that. 9/11 killed hundreds more people, wounded double the number of Pearl Harbor, and caused massively greater destruction, $40.2 billion worth, not counting all the economic losses it has caused since that date. There is no powerful British Empire now for the US to fear. There is no military capability anywhere that would dare to challenge the world's only superpower, who everyone knows can squelch any nation or coalition we choose to target. So what has our answer been to 9/11? I want to review some key points since the attack in chronological order, not just of our government's policies against terrorism, but above all of the American public's response to them, and the comparable policies and response in World War II, which was fought just 60 years ago. My real purpose in discussing foreign policy here is to form a hypothesis about our countrymen today. Who is the American public now, and what do they think about world and moral issues? Are the men answering the opinion polls since 9/11 the posterity of the Founding Fathers? Is this what is left of the noblest experiment in history? On the day of Pearl Harbor, Americans were stunned and enraged. The next day, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, of whom I am no admirer, gave his short, famous Day of Infamy speech promising absolute victory over the Japanese. At first, when 9/11 occurred, the country reacted in similar terms: disbelief and rage. There was grief for the victims, admiration for the heroic police and firemen, but above all, there was a desire for self-defense, retaliation, revenge. There was a surge of patriotism. American flags appeared everywhere. The national atmosphere was solemn, tense, funereal. Hollywood canceled programs that seemed insensitive. The left was scared stiff and kept silent. There was no more business as usual. The country was gearing up psychologically for a battle of life and death. On September 20th, in the midst of the national fury, President Bush gave his famous speech to Congress. Like Roosevelt, he was seeking to rally and inspire the country. And he too pledged a militant response and the destruction of our enemies. The biggest difference between the speeches, however, is what FDR did not say that Bush, by contrast, insisted upon. Bush's speech is worthy of attention. It foretokens the whole response to terrorism of patriotic Americans ever since. Along with his vows of retaliation, Bush's speech is laced with appeasement. Appeasement of the very nations and institutions that created or feed the terrorist axis. Not to put too fine a point on it, our president sucked up to virtually every enemy in sight. He told us about his gratitude for prayers for us in Arabic, about, quote, the sympathy offered at a mosque in Cairo, about the Pakistanis and Iranians killed in the explosion, about, quote, our many Muslim friends. He boasted that we not only respect Afghanistan, but are currently its largest source of humanitarian aid. He offered his gratitude for support from, quote, the Islamic world, unquote. The terrorists, he stressed, another quote, are a fringe form of Islamic extremism that perverts the peaceful teaching of Islam. We respect your faith, its teachings are good, unquote. Now, Bush, being deeply religious himself, did not even hint at the truth, that religiosity is the indispensable background and driving force of 9/11. Everyone knows the role in the anti-American jihad of Islamic faith, from the mosques and seminaries in Iran and Saudi Arabia, all the way to the crazed suicide bombers hurrying to meet their 72 perpetual virgins in paradise. Now, I don't need to demonize Islam. The Islamic world enjoyed a high civilization during the very Middle Ages, when Christianity was making the West just about as barbaric as the Middle East is today. The issue is not Islam versus Christianity. Every religion, by its nature, by its rejection of reason, is compelled to turn to force and violence ultimately. Every religion is a threat to civilization as soon as it can get its hands on political power, just as Christianity was a threat and a malignant force for 1,000 years after Rome fell. So let us grant in principle that Islam is no worse than Christianity, and that there is a large moderate wing within Islam that is not the initiator of the jihads against us. My point is that this is irrelevant to any discussion of 9/11. Irrelevant, because even so, Islam is still the enemy. In every war of aggression, there are within the territory of the aggressors a large group of moderate types, in quotes. These are the vast horde of Peter Keatings, or conformists, who initiate nothing, but merely watch silently or follow the latest trend. These types would never start any crusade on their own. It is only a small militant minority with access to political power or colluding governments. It is only the activists at the top that initiate atrocities. And this was just as true in Japan in the 40s as in Islam today. In both cases, vast groups of men were innocent of any plans for aggression and wanted to live in peace with the United States. But once the activist leadership has acted, the moderates no longer count in history. They either go along passively, becoming mere ciphers of history, or they come to endorse emotionally what they see their leadership doing. This kind of capitulation is what happened to the people of Japan, and this is what is happening now in the Arab street, where, well before the war in Iraq, ever since 9/11, we have seen massive Muslim hatred of America, even among crowds who are not Islamic fundamentalists. Now, if there were a vocal Islamic movement attacking the jihad and championing America's self-defense, that would make a big difference here. But to my knowledge, there is no such movement, neither here nor abroad. In a speech declaring war against a vicious enemy who has attacked you, It is a moral crime to distinguish between the active instigators and their passive legions. What you must denounce in such a speech, if you are a proper patriotic leader, is the essence of the threat. Philosophically, on the deepest level, what Bush should have said was some equivalent of the prayer which Maureen Dowd, herself, by the way, a religious woman, saw scrawled on a wall in Washington soon after 9/11. Dear God, save us from the people who believe in you. Of course, we could hardly expect Bush to say or even think such a thing. But he could at least have said that the enemy was a major and widely popular wing within Islam. Instead, he brazenly pretended that apart from a handful of lunatics, the whole world of Islam was our friend. What would the country have thought of FDR if in his December 8th speech he had expressed gratitude for prayers in Japanese, adulated our many Japanese friends, denounced the bombers as perverters of Shintoism, and classified the attackers as a fringe form of fascism? Do you think Americans would have stood for this in 1941? Or would they have cried out in protest because of the shame to them of displaying such national weakness and cowardice? But what was our country's response to Bush's speech? It went wild with praise. Commentators across the spectrum, speaking in an atmosphere of national adulation for Bush, thanked God for having a true leader in such perilous times. In the polls of October 2001, primarily on the basis of this one speech, almost 80% of the country approved of the way Bush was handling foreign affairs. And that is an extraordinarily high figure. The American rage over 9/11 lasted about 3 weeks, as against the angry militant resolve during the long years of World War II. Even as America was going to war in Afghanistan, such as it did, there was a gradual but easy transition in the nation back to psychological business as usual. The canceled shows were cautiously reinstated. The left was noisy. It was normal life again. The public seemed to think it had done its part since it had plastered the flag everywhere. The enemy, after all, Bush had said, is not a major world force, but a mere lunatic fringe. And we must have, in his words, patience for a, quote, long war against it, and who can live with a permanent emergency. Most important and most gruesome, it had now been a month, 2 months, 6 months since the bombing. So it was starting to feel to a great many people like mere history. The cries for vengeance died down. The president was in charge. People said, who am I to judge foreign policy? The emotional focus at home changed from rage to grief and praise. Grief for the victims who were methodically eulogized, and praise for the domestic heroes of 9/11. Now, of course, it's proper to grieve for victims and admire the courageous heroes who tried to rescue them. But if your country is at war with a mortal enemy, these issues should not be the major focus of your emotion. Your whole passion must be on destroying the enemy. If what dominates you is grief rather than anger, the victims, not their killers, the tragic past, not self-defense and a smashing victory in the future, that is a sure sign of a people starting to withdraw emotionally from the world and give up the battle. Give it up internally. Now, the topic of self-defense brings me to the war in Afghanistan. Its essence is contained in the fact that before it even started, the government changed its name. The first code name for this military operation was Infinite Justice. The name was dropped to avoid offending Muslims who were objecting to the name on the ground that only God can mete out infinite justice. I understand, Mr. Rumsfeld, one of the leading hawks, replied. America went into Afghanistan filled with ambivalence, uncertainty, and even guilt. Our leadership was afraid of Afghan civilian casualties, afraid of American casualties, and afraid of being hated in the Mideast as infidel imperialists. So they settled on a pitiful proxy war in which we were not combatants but merely advisors. And what we advised was warring tribes open to bribery from all sides, catching prisoners and then letting them escape, often en masse, as in Tora Bora, while the U.S. looked on helplessly wringing its hands. The Americans sent not many soldiers to that war, but a great many expensive bombs and missiles, which achieved numerous and mostly useless holes in the ground. They did not dare population centers, where al-Qaeda and the Taliban promptly hid out, thereby eluding capture. And along with the bombs, of course, we covered the country with care packages. Was this a war or a charade? A war in self-defense must be fought without self-crippling restrictions placed on our commanders. And it must secure undiluted, unconditional victory as fast as possible, regardless of how many innocent civilians are caught in the line of fire or are deliberate targets of that fire. These innocents suffer and die because of the action of their own government in sponsoring the initiation of force against us. Their fate, therefore, is their government's moral responsibility, not ours. Now, if you want to know what a real war would be, I quote a brief excerpt from a book entitled The Soul of Battle by Victor Davis Hanson. On one day in March 1945, an extreme day granted, but still only one day, and I quote, 334 B-29s left for Tokyo. 500-pound incendiary clusters fell over Tokyo every 50 feet. Within 30 minutes, a 28-mile-per-hour ground wind sent the flames roaring out of control. Temperatures approached 1,800 degrees Fahrenheit. The general in command, Curtis LeMay, wished to destroy completely the material and psychological capital of the Japanese people, I'm still quoting, on the brutal theory that once civilians had tasted what their soldiers had done to others, only then might their murderous armies crack. Over 80,000 Japanese died on that one day. 40,000 were injured. 267,000 buildings were destroyed. 1 million Japanese were left homeless. Unquote. Now that is how we fought in World War II, and how we deterred future attacks on the United States, and how we wiped out fascism. How do you think the American public in the 40s would have reacted if the war against Japan had been conducted like the war in Afghanistan? Now, I was only a child at the time, but my guess is that there would have been riots in the streets and that FDR would have been impeached. What the war in Afghanistan did is to send a message at that time to the world that the U.S. is a self-made paper tiger to scare no one. In practical terms, all that war really accomplished was to scatter the enemy, including most of its leadership to other countries, mainly Pakistan, leaving the threat to the U.S. from al-Qaeda as bad as ever, which remains true to this day, as even the CIA has stated publicly. The war in Afghanistan was not only a colossal defeat for the world's only superpower, it was a joke. Now, what was the American public's response to this debacle? We won the war, the president and the press said brazenly, and people en masse bought it. They were still passionately for Bush. There was no challenge to his leadership or to his method of waging war, except from the far left, but not from the Republicans in Congress nor from the Democrats. There was a virtual hysteria of patriotism, in quotes, surrounding Bush at that point, just as there is today. Patriotism seemed to be defined as rally around the leader blindly, seemingly no matter what he does. In effect, to challenge Bush's foreign policy in any way is un-American and almost treasonable. But despite all their excitement, people seemed to realize on some level that the war in Afghanistan had solved nothing. Our leaders kept stressing that the problem of terrorism was worldwide, virtually intractable, here to stay for a long, long time. So people felt helpless and afraid. 66% of Americans at that point said that they looked to the future without hope, that they believed life would not be better for their children than it was for them. I'm sure you saw, as I did, you could see it gradually happening all around you. People were slowly giving up on the attempt to eradicate terrorism. They were learning to resign themselves to it, to adjust to it, to accept it as a normal part of life which is here to stay. What lesson did you learn from 9/11? People were asked continually by the press. I read the answer dozens of times. I learned to hug my children. I learned not to take my family for granted. I learned that life is ephemeral and we must enjoy the moment because who knows how long we have. At the time of Pearl Harbor, no such sentiments were voiced. The attitude then was, it is not American lives that are ephemeral, but the lives of the Japanese. And we are going to make damn sure that they are ephemeral, that they're over as fast as possible. A university professor at Columbia University, writing in the New York Times, was elated by the new American sense of helplessness and hopelessness, which he gleefully picked up on. It is, he gloated, quote, a whiff of dread for the land of hope, unquote. Now, this new dread was metaphysical, not practical. It was the fear and helplessness that people experience, no matter how rich and militarily strong they are, when they renounce the possibility of acting to end a threat and instead accept evil as the normal. So the fact that America is the only superpower had virtually no effect on people. They remained afraid of the rest of the world, even without any practical reason for it. Regarding the war in Iraq, for example, a retired nurse speaking for a large segment of Americans said before it started that she was afraid that, quote, the rest of the world might turn on us if Mr. Bush failed to pursue his goals with patience, unquote. The emotional state of permanent dread is unbearable. So a great many people here simply wanted the terrorist crisis to end, somehow. Many started talking about healing and closure, despite the facts. And many took to stating that, after all, there are other concerns beside terrorism to worry about, such as the economy. Confronted by the possibility of the ultimate downfall of Western civilization, Americans in a poll last January, and I quote, said they were twice as concerned about the economy as they were about either a pending war in Iraq or the war on terrorism, unquote. That indicates how short-range our country has become. Afghanistan was wrong war number one in the fight against terrorism. Obviously, it's proper to retaliate right away against the specific thugs who perpetrated 9/11. But terrorism is an ideological phenomenon. The ideology of Islamic fundamentalism, the ideology of burning religious hatred of secular Western values. And you cannot stop or even wound such a lethal ideology merely by chasing after some of its thugs and their hiding places. To defeat Nazism in World War II, nothing less than a massive assault on its home base, Germany, on the country at the heart of Nazism's support and export, was necessary. The same applies to Islamic fundamentalism. And the Germany of Islamic fundamentalism is not Afghanistan or Iraq. It is Iran, as I will discuss shortly. Now let's jump to November 2002, when the Republicans surprised the country by winning both houses of Congress. They won, apparently, because of Bush's foreign policy. Despite everything they had seen, a poll taken at the time, quote, showed Republicans beating Democrats by 30 points on the question, which party is tough enough on terrorism, unquote. The Democrats are not tough enough, sure. But the Republicans are on Islamic fundamentalist terrorism. Give me a break. Now, of course, you can say that people are at the mercy of the intellectuals who bear the fundamental blame for the public state of mind, and that's true. But the intellectuals are not all powerful, and beyond a certain point, the people, especially in this country, which still has the best people on earth, the people are responsible regardless of what they've been taught. Even non-intellectuals still have their powers as human beings. the power of observation, of thought, and of righteous indignation. If they don't exercise those powers, they cannot be excused, romanticized, or whitewashed. They must be judged morally for their passivity. And this brings me to the present. Wrong war number 2, in my opinion, Iraq. The first thing wrong with this war was the 6-month-long spectacle which preceded it. The spectacle of the United States on its knees groveling, practically begging enemies, neutrals, friends, everybody in the UN and NATO to approve it. Now, if Bush's argument was correct, and Iraq was a mortal threat to the survival of our country, how could we give up the prerogative to take immediate, unilateral action against it? How could we allow months to go by because of the whims of France? President Bush finally gave up on the UN and came out for unilateral American action, while stressing, of course, that it wasn't really unilateral since we had a large coalition with us. But he and Powell hastened to make clear the vital importance of UN approval and of its involvement in Iraq somehow after the war. The implication seems to be that we are not a sovereign state any longer, with the right and the autonomy to defend ourselves, but only a fragment of a world body, over half of which hates us passionately. Now, no one dreamed of wheeling and dealing before any international committee in regard to whether it was all right for the U.S. to respond at once to Pearl Harbor. Yet Mr. Bush's popularity was still strong this year. As of January, 59% of Americans approved of the way Bush is performing his job. Now, in the same poll, believe it or not, 52% of the public said they believed, quote, the government has done all it can be reasonably expected to do to protect the country from future terrorist attacks, unquote. So on Iraq too, it has been follow the leader. And mind you, this is true even though the majority understands that there are grave flaws in our foreign policy. In January, for example, 55% of Americans said the administration was reacting to events as they occurred abroad rather than having a clear foreign policy plan. And yet, despite this, people remain largely happy with the president and what they call his hard nose, in the words of one of his admirers. The country has followed Bush all the way. Observing his deference to the UN, they mimicked it even when he personally was growing impatient. In February, an astounding 59% of Americans said they believed the president should give the UN more time. 63% said that Washington should not act without the support of its allies. And get this one, in March last month, nearly 2/3 of the country said that Bush should take into account the views of anti-war protesters before he acted. People wanted world consensus before action. And if you need to know even more of the public mind on this issue, people were asked in February about their attitude toward the Iraqi war if substantial Iraqi casualties were involved. That was the word. When faced with this question, the 66% pre-war majority collapsed. The country was evenly split, 46% in favor of the war to 45% against. In other words, a huge number of Americans do not want a war with casualties. An almost identical change from pro-war to even split occurred when people were asked about a war with Iraq if there were substantial American casualties. So on the one hand, Americans claim to believe by a 2-to-1 majority that the war in Iraq is an issue of national survival against an enemy who can help to annihilate us with unbelievably horrible weapons. Yet on the other hand, these people said we were not to be in any particular hurry in doing something about it, and certainly there must be no substantial casualties on either side. Now, the public was and still is following the leader obediently. Two leaders in this case. The state says war, and Bush's leader, the church, says no casualties. So the American pragmatist on the street says, okay, I accept all of it, everything, whatever I'm told. Who am I to decide on morality or foreign policy? Now let's look at our choice of country to attack at this point in our history. Now, let me tell you first where I do agree with the president on this issue. Iraq, as ruled by Saddam Hussein, was a brutal dictatorship and an enemy who had to be stopped. Hussein was ominously armed, and his regime did have some actual ties to the terrorists. I also approve totally of what is called preemptive war, and I agree that it is very much better to wage war on Iraq than to sit on our hands and do nothing at all. But the obvious question on all these very same counts is, why Iraq and not Iran? Iran, as everyone in Washington knows, is the birthplace in 1979 and the center of the modern Muslim fundamentalist movement. That is why Iran has much greater ties with all the terrorist groups than the secular Hussein regime ever did. And why Iran, by the admission of our own State Department, is the worst country in the world in this respect. In other words, it's incomparably more active than Iraq in turning out, supporting, arming, and exporting terrorists. Iran, too, is a brutal dictatorship. And it, too, is working feverishly and even more effectively in some respects than Iraq was to stockpile nuclear and other weapons of mass destruction. Even Bush himself included Iran in his axis of evil, along with Iraq and North Korea. But he does nothing to single out Iran as by far our gravest enemy, gravest in the context of the terrorist crisis. Why not? Because Iran is the only religious nation of those three. And Bush does not want to name this fact. In other words, to have to reveal the ideological reason why Iran is our supreme enemy. Because his whole worldview is tied to the virtue and alleged peacefulness of religion as such, of any variety. By the way, if we are short of countries to target militarily, what about such obviously eligible places as Saudi Arabia or Pakistan, both incomparably greater strongholds of terrorism than Iraq? Bush evades all this. He even regards Saudi Arabia and Pakistan as allies. As to Iran, he has told us we need not take any action because we can now count on its civilian student unrest, its internal ferment, and possible change on its own. In fact, its pro-Western unrest and ferment, which are real, makes it the obviously logical place for us to have begun to fight. Now, I may add that if we had taken on Iran or Saudi Arabia and did so seriously, using all our powers, without restraint, killing its government officials, and wiping out the country's terrorists, armaments, and anti-American agitators, wherever they are, inside mosques or outside them. If we had done that, then Iraq and probably North Korea too would have been no further threat to us. Even if left alone, without any war against him, a thug like Saddam Hussein would have run for cover from us if he had believed that the U.S. really meant business in the world, just as he did run as soon as he saw in Baghdad that the U.S. resolve was real. A war against Iraq, however, was the easiest war for Bush to have picked for many reasons. Among them is the fact that the Republicans were eager to erase the black mark of Bush Sr.'s disgraceful flight from Iraq in 1991. But the major reason the choice of Iraq was easy for Mr. Bush is that Iraq under Saddam Hussein was a secular, non-religious country. It was not a bastion of Islam or of fundamentalist hatred. So you could declare war on it without really, mortally, offending or challenging any religious movement, including Islam. In other words, this is the perversity. Precisely because Iraq was not a source or significant supporter of the ideology at the root of 9/11, for that very reason the Republicans felt morally allowed to wage war on it. And a more real war this time than against the deeply religious Taliban in Afghanistan. By the way, now that the Iraqi war is over, as you are now seeing, the administration has started making noises about Syria, another easy target for the same cowardly reason. Another secular thug state without any ideological or Islamic fundamentalist basis. Now, a war picked in part because its government is not Islamic will not be too effective in reining in those Islamic governments that nurture and harbor most of the terrorists. It seems obvious that our administration is giving such countries a free pass. Now there have been some hints from hawks in Washington that Iran's turn might yet be coming. The best proposal so far is from Senator Sam Brownback of Kansas, who wants us to put tens of millions of dollars behind the popular movement in Iran to overthrow the Ayatollah's regime. If this kind of approach ever became administration policy, Bush could still save the world, and I would be happy to tear this speech up. But unfortunately, so far, there is tremendous opposition in Washington to any such policy, which at this point, therefore, is still only a fantasy. Now, in actual fact, during the Iraq War, I don't know if you know this one, but this happened. American forces deliberately bombed bases of the main armed group of Iranian guerrillas, which had thousands of fighters just inside the Iraqi border aimed against the Ayatollahs. These men were anti-fundamentalism, anti-terrorism, pro the US, and advocates of a secular government in Iran. The press speculates that our attacks on these friends of our cause, and I'm quoting now from the New York Times, quote, were intended as a thank you gesture by the US to the Iranian government for its non-interference in the Iraqi war, unquote. Now I submit that no villain in fiction can beat this action for sheer perverse evil. Now, having picked Iraq for bad reasons, our leaders proceeded to make things worse by stressing over and over that our motives in this war were not only or even primarily our own self-defense, they were also strongly altruistic. The war's code name was not Operation American Safety, but Operation Iraqi Freedom. We fought, we were told, not only to protect the whole world from Saddam, but even more important, so that we can shower the lovable Iraqis with everything good: food, medicine, supplies, individual rights, freedom, a whole new reconstruction at a cost of $100 billion, you name it. And that is what makes self-defense okay, as against being merely selfishness on our part. In other words, in this war, we were not even permitted to say too loudly that we are out to save ourselves and our own country. That would be unacceptable egoism. Now, with some notable and glorious exceptions, the conduct of the war largely followed from its stated moral purpose. Now, I'm not talking about the undeniable courage and heroism of our troops, nor about their number, about which I have no opinion, but about the battle orders. The troops were instructed methodically to pull their punches, i.e. to spare Iraq's civilians and its infrastructure, and even more, and I quote, they were instructed, quote, to avoid the kind of fighting that might enrage the Iraqi people, unquote. We are at war against this country, but there must be no fighting that would enrage the people in the country. In pursuing this policy, hundreds of critical high-priority Iraqi targets were removed from the attack plan. Massive World War II-style attacks directly on urban centers such as Basra or Baghdad were forbidden. Instead, we were given the spectacle of our troops crawling through blinding sandstorms to Baghdad, subject to continual assault and ambush. And in fact, to show you how our troops were hobbled, each military unit in Iraq, try and guess this, had a lawyer attached to it. His function was to vet any decision to target the enemy when there was any risk of civilian casualties. For example, if a mortar launcher was next to a school, the soldiers needed first to get permission from a lawyer before they could take out the launcher, even if such delay involved some risk to their own lives. If they didn't get the permission, they were told that they could be prosecuted for war crimes should any Iraqi civilian be hurt. Meanwhile, Iraq's gleeful policy in response was to deploy civilian shields everywhere, including in schools and hospitals, to disguise soldiers in civilian clothes, to dress an army officer as a taxi driver and force him to drive out as a suicide bomber, to use ambulances to carry troops dressed in white coats who suddenly start shooting at vulnerable Americans, made vulnerable as a matter of policy by their own leadership. One U.S. commander in the field stated the situation as follows: This war, he said early on, is, quote, asymmetrical warfare. Asymmetrical warfare. I continue the quote. The Iraqis are blasting away knowing that for moral reasons the Americans can't, unquote. Our policy, in other words, was known to be emboldening the enemy, prolonging battles, and endangering American troops. The number of our casualties, thankfully, was small, but the horror is that many of our injuries and deaths were utterly unnecessary, the results of our own policies. The Pentagon was actually struggling with an obscene question. How many needless American deaths should it allow? Or as a New York Times writer put it during the war, quote, the military must struggle with the deadly calculus of how many casualties it is willing to incur among its own forces to save civilian lives, unquote. Now, we are speaking here of the injury or death of courageous American boys, hundreds of them, many of whom set aside jobs or college plans in order, so they thought, to fight for American liberty. And I say that even one of these boys' lives deliberately imperiled by our so-called moral policy is an act of immorality, is in fact a moral atrocity. It is literally turning our soldiers into sacrificial offerings. But Mr. Bush has no problem with this, apparently. Americans, he has said approvingly, know how to, quote, sacrifice for the liberty of strangers, unquote. Now, thankfully, the Pentagon did not adhere to this sacrificial policy consistently. In the battle for Baghdad, there was less concern with civilians and more commitment to decisive military action, which is what made this battle, in my opinion, the most impressive American success story in the war and finally collapsed the Hussein government. The stated American goal to shock and awe the enemy worked in Baghdad after 2 weeks of failing. Unfortunately, this feat did nothing to change our basic policy. Time and again thereafter, our troops were made vulnerable without any military reason. As just one example, when gunfire was aimed at our Marines from a mosque, they were forbidden to bomb or even enter the place aggressively. They were reduced to what the press calls fierce fighting, firing from the outside to defend themselves against entrenched, protected Iraqis. The result was 1 American Marine dead and 22 wounded, senselessly because such carnage could easily have been prevented. We won the Iraqi war as quickly as we did, despite our restrained and even self-sabotaging policies, because it was a lopsided contest from the start, which it would have been virtually impossible for us to lose. On one side, the superpower, with all its technological might, and on the other, a third world pipsqueak, not yet even recovered militarily from its defeat in '91. What is disturbing, however, is the amount of, quote, fierce fighting such a contemptible pipsqueak could put up against us because we allowed it to happen. A retired general who served in the first Gulf War predicted that I'm quoting now, the difficult first 2 weeks of the war, even though he said we will prevail, but he said that the difficult first 2 weeks would harm the nation's standing as a military force. Here's a direct quote from the general. What's troublesome is the loss of deterrent value. A month ago, everybody in the world looked at the U.S. military as being 10 feet tall. We're not 10 feet tall, unquote. Now, although I'm certainly no military or geopolitical expert, I personally think that after Baghdad, the general statement goes a bit too far. This war, for all its flaws, will serve, I think, as some degree of deterrent, as at least a partial or temporary deterrent, helping to prevent aggressive actions against us by hostile governments in the Mideast and elsewhere. So we have caused some fear in our enemies, although nothing like the total fear and absolute deterrence a World War II-style war would have produced. We have shown again that American power is supreme, but that we are still morally unsure of our right fully to use it. So we leave open to the world the questions. Will the U.S. use its power after the next provocation? And if so, how seriously? So long as these questions remain open, we remain vulnerable. Our enemies who passionately hate us will probably leave us alone for a while, but they are not crushed. They are not paralyzed by fear. They are not convinced that jihad against us is simply unthinkable. So who knows if and how they will rally and attack us again next month or next year, once the Iraqi war has faded into history. Let us say at the most optimistic that after Iraq, we are not a paper tiger anymore, but an uncertain, erratic, and contradictory tiger who may or may not bite if hit again, as in 9/11. If the president were to keep our troops in Iraq, using it as a perfectly positioned staging ground in a campaign against a real terrorist nation, that would send the world an unequivocal message. But he's told us repeatedly that as soon as there is a new government in Iraq, our forces will leave the country. On the other hand, the Pentagon has announced that they want to keep permanent access to air bases in Iraq to back up possible future action in the Mideast. Administration policy clearly is still not decided. In the last few days, I've seen some good statements, even one good action by the administration. They have called Syria, which is a major terrorist supporter, a rogue state, and cut off an important oil pipeline from Iraq to Syria. But here again, as I've already indicated to you, they're talking about another secular state like Iraq rather than a true fundamentalist ideological enemy. And again, their avowed purpose is pure altruism. The justification they are offering, if we ever do anything, is not going to be American self-defense, but, quote from the administration, Syria occupies Lebanon, unquote. And even on this weak and misguided basis, senior administration officials have rushed to declare that people are misunderstanding the U.S. intentions since the Iraqi war, and that we must press America's advantage, quote, without sounding threatening, unquote, to anyone, including Syria. So what does it all mean for the future of U.S. military action? Does it mean anything? Who knows? If Bush now stood up and said righteously, not just to Syria, but to the whole Middle East, don't mess with us or our interests or our friends anymore, or else we will treat you as another Iraq. If he said that, that would be meaningful and unequivocal. But instead, he has already agreed to pressure Israel into more concessions to the Palestinians in order, as the Times puts it, quote, to placate anti-American sentiments in the Arab world, unquote. In other words, so far, it seems to be contradiction, lack of direction, and even appeasement as usual. As to our future in Iraq, we can already know some of what is in store for our forces. Not only festering guerrilla warfare by hostile Iraqis and others, did you know that after a year, there are still U.S. combat missions going in 6 different provinces in Afghanistan? Not only guerrilla war, but even worse, the hopeless task of putting together the several warring tribes in Iraq and the dozens of clashing exile groups and all the power-seeking UN agencies in order to make out of this hash a new, stable, quote, democratic government. And supposing we did somehow achieve this impossible feat, how long do you think it would be before the new democracy voted to turn itself into another Islamic fundamentalist state? That is all I have to say tonight about the war in Iraq. Now, what about our nation's reaction to the war? The public is euphoric, flush with victory. Despite everything wrong with the war, despite being the wrong war with the wrong goal, embracing some very wrong policies based on a wrong moral code, despite all of it, 79% of Americans, according to the latest poll, said that they remained unshaken in their support of Bush's war policies. A typical case is a lady from Spokane, Washington, an account manager for a financial company, who declared recently that she has trusted President Bush, quote, to do the right thing, unquote, ever since 9/11. And as to the war in Iraq, she said, quote, it has got to be done and I will support whatever President Bush does, unquote. And by the way, believe it or not, a majority, 62% of Americans now believe that the nation is winning the war on terrorism. 62%. Now you talk about the emotion of the moment warping objective thought and judgment. Now let us ask for the source of what I can only describe, regretfully, as our passive, unthinking, and too often gutless public. What causes this amoral, follow-the-leader mentality, content to fight in emotionalist, out-of-context spurts, changing its basic view with each new event of the moment? We're lost, no, we've won, etc. My answer in a word is brainwashing, not political, but educational. Brainwashing carried out for decades by the school system. The method is simple. You undercut the ability of the young, generation after generation, to think independently, while at the same time you insinuate into their minds all the doctrines that will destroy basic values, kill initiative in political affairs, and paralyze people's capacity for action. You end up with a nation of sheep. Now, I repeat what I said earlier. A man bears some of the responsibility if he succumbs to this brainwashing. And the proof is that many Americans have not yet succumbed to it. But tragically, the majority, I believe, have succumbed. The single greatest destroyer in this context has been progressive education, which in various forms still dominates the U.S. from kindergarten through graduate school. Young intelligences who desperately need guidance if they're to develop their intellectual capacities are taught routinely that there are no objective facts, no principles, no absolutes, no certainty, and no philosophy to give them long-range direction. They are taught that there is no alternative, therefore, but to act as pragmatists, to treat any problem short-range, on its own terms, out of context, and to cope with it by doing whatever feels good and seems to work for now, given the social or world consensus of the moment. And as to tomorrow, they feel, who can know? Now, what can possibly result from such training? Training in disregarding reality, abandoning thought in favor of feeling, and adapting to the group. What can possibly result but the atrophy of individual self-confidence and of intellectual activity? And to the extent that a person then sees himself as a helpless being caught in an unknowable flux, how can he act except by the guidance of an authority, political or otherwise? An authority which will lift the impossible responsibility of judgment, decision, and action from his shoulders and tell him in any confusing situation how things stand, what to feel, and what must be done. But the catch here is that our own leadership by this time has had the very same education. So it's the pragmatist leading the pragmatists. Washington and with it the country are immersed in the flow of momentary concretes, staring at single trees with no interest in or even idea of a forest. At one moment, the government thinks we must capture Osama above all. At the next, the president tells us coolly that one man is not important. The public response, well, okay, maybe it's a change, but there are no absolutes. At one moment, we're told Al-Qaeda is the enemy we must go after and root out. At the next, a single one of its arms suppliers, out of dozens, is the real enemy to smash. And anyway, what about the oppressed Iraqis? And the public response, okay, if that's today's crisis, but let's not antagonize the world consensus. At one moment, in a given month, the market is down or unemployment is up, so the economy seems to the public to be the most important issue facing them. Who can know the long-range future of the world anyway, people ask. What I do know is that right now I'm out of a job. Now the other part of the brainwashing. As you're creating a mental void in the nation, you simultaneously fill it with moral corruption of a kind which will mute or stifle self-assertion on the part of the citizenry. In this connection, the altruism of Bush's policies, long prepared in the schools and churches and entrenched even further by the war in Iraq, is crucial. Whatever the government does, if it throws billions away on humanitarian largesse to the enemy, or creates nightmare chaos at the airports, or piles up American casualties in the name of liberating the foreign oppressed, people tend to accept, they don't complain too much, because they know it's their duty not to be selfish, but to serve others and sacrifice. Part of altruism, of course, is forgiveness and mercy, which God commands. And God, of course, for the conservative and patriotic wing of the country, is the biggest authority of all. So we must now not merely preach piety, as in the old World War II days, but actually obey the Lord in action. We must fight New Testament wars with battle plans taken from the Sermon on the Mount, following principles defined 2,000 years ago by a sect that was waiting for the world to come to an end and couldn't care less what happened during this life. Do you see how much more Christian, in other words, how much more faith-directed, how much less reason-directed our public has become in just 60 years? Now, beside the helplessly obedient skeptic and the obediently helpless Christian, there are many corrupt and paralyzing ideas circulating in our country. As just one more example, think of multiculturalism, which is an assault on our national self-esteem and initiative of unprecedented proportions. Are we any better, many educated Americans today ask, than the cultures that hate us? Don't they have a right to their ideas and values too? Do you see how we can be the world's only superpower and nevertheless be unable properly to fight our enemies? Fearsome weaponry is of no value if the man with his finger on the button cannot bring himself or his countrymen to make the decision to push it. Now, at the start of this country, men who had been brought up to think independently and to act long range, according to the principle of pursuing their own happiness, these men could unite and go to war in a passionate cause. Just think of it. These men fought a righteous, bloody rebellion against such relatively small evils as a tax on tea or on stamps, while their posterity today, not all, but a frightening number of them, facing cataclysmic threats, sits befuddled and becalmed, making only sporadic forays here and there without context or overall plan when the government tells them to do it. That is what I mean by the title of my talk, America versus Americans. In other words, versus a great number of today's Americans. Today we need something even more important than the right war. We need the root that will make it possible for us to do whatever is necessary in our own self-defense and to do it righteously without any moral qualms. In other words, we need an ideological war against all of the doctrines that are confusing and paralyzing this nation. The Arabs, and I'm quoting now from Stephen Cohen, a Middle East specialist, quote, "The Arabs understand that this war is happening at two levels, on the ground in Iraq, and then an ideological war once the ground war is over," unquote. The Arabs know the real issue. Do we? Well, we at the Ayn Rand Institute are doing what we can to spread some better ideas. Dr. Yaron Brook alone, its executive director, I asked him for these figures, in the last 6 months has been interviewed on over 60 radio and television programs and in the press, and in addition has given over 30 speeches to groups large and small trying to get the word out. But of course, no one man or institute can change the world. Some people say that the next terrorist atrocity on American soil will make a difference and finally wake up the public. I hope so. But I fear that without the right philosophic ideas, the next atrocity too, however monstrous, will probably in the long run change very little in our policies. The tragedy is that America is so vulnerable when it would be so easy for it to become triumphantly secure. There is still time to change our direction, but not a lot of time. History is not infinitely elastic. So I appeal to you in conclusion, if you can contribute anything to a revolution of ideas in this country, a revolution that will oust the establishment ideology and recreate a rational public, now is the time to become a philosophic hero and to do it on whatever scale is open to you. If you can make enough of your countrymen start to think, America can still be saved. Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Can we get air conditioning?
Mark, can we get the temperature lowered even more?
Or even to some extent.
So anybody with a question, the center aisle here. And please, I'll repeat this, questions. And I will cut you off if you start making long statements. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Military solution aside, or temporary, well, interdicting these hostile and dangerous regimes aside, how do you seriously propose to address a problem which Trifikovic describes in his book, The Sword of the Prophet, as one emanating from the life and philosophy of the Prophet himself, who was violent, who killed hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of people, beheaded them, and so on and so on. How do you propose that we address the madrasas, the schools that are teaching this fanaticism throughout the Muslim world? Most of the children in Pakistan are being educated at the madrasas. And what the Western world in general, I think, is facing from these madrasas throughout the Muslim world is exactly, it seems to me, what Israel is facing with Palestine, where we have not...
Can we get to the question?
Well, it's, how do we address this education of fanaticism, of hate?
Let him answer the question. No.
You've said
Well, in
enough.
We got the
Palestine,
question.
they're also
We got
addressing
the question. We got
It's
the
also
question.
incitement.
Thank you.
You can sit down because I'm not going to answer anything further that you say. I have already addressed the issue that the problem is nothing unique to Islam. And I'm not going to repeat that. No matter how many atrocities you ascribe to Muhammad, there are plenty of atrocities on the record of Christianity. And the Inquisition is merely one obvious example of it. So the goal here is not to fight a particular religion. And if you ask how do you combat the ideology that is anti-American, anti-Western, anti-secular, it is only by upholding a positive philosophy and defending it. If there was someone championing, as an ideological movement, reason, logic as against faith and mysticism, selfishness, the pursuit of your own happiness as against self-sacrifice and service, individualism as against collectivism, laissez-faire capitalism as against statism. If there were someone championing that, and of course that's what we stand for, but very few people stand for that. We have liberals on the one side who are skeptics, and we have conservatives on the other side who are religious. So one side says you can't know anything, and the other side says yes you can, but by revelation from God. Now neither of those is going to affect the course of the world. We are then simply giving up. We're saying we have no answers, or it's our blind faith versus yours. The only way to win the youth of the world and to win the future is through rational ideas, a rational philosophy. The enemy is not any particular man or prophet, but the ideology of unreason, which is just as prevalent in the faculty at Harvard as it is in the Middle East.
Kevin.
Dr. Bekoff, thank you for your talk tonight. A lot of the people I've spoken with feel very hopeless about the current world situation. And many people that I've talked with have a concern that I don't really know how to answer, and that is, how does anything that the U.S. does as far as retaliation militarily, how can that act as a deterrent when the Islamic fundamentalists are on such an extreme premise of self-sacrifice, and they want to destroy themselves in the process?
Well, my answer to that is this. If they wanted it that badly, they would all commit suicide. But anybody that remains alive and wants a job and wants a home, to that extent has some pro-life element that's keeping him in existence. The only way to be completely consistent is to kill yourself, which the suicide bombers do, but they are not the majority of the Middle East or of any country in it. So what we have to do militarily is inspire fear in the people who still have some remnant of wanting to remain alive. If they were all crazed suicide bombers, there would be nothing we could do but just annihilate them all with our military might. But what we can do is inspire fear, real fear, and that will unequivocally affect the overwhelming majority of people and therefore of the governments over there. So I think there is something we can do. You can't be consistently pro-death, not if you're still living. You can go.
Dr. Peikoff, as I understood your comments, the reason we haven't attacked Iran yet is because they are a religious nation. However, we did attack Afghanistan, which was a fundamentalist Islamic state. We have not attacked North Korea, which is a secular state, and one of our best friends is the Palestinian Authority. And I wondered if you thought there may be other considerations in our targeting beside religiosity.
Yeah, I think there may be other considerations, but let's take them in order. What is the first one?
Afghanistan.
Afghanistan. Now, if you noticed an interesting thing, when the war in Afghanistan was starting, President Bush said on television that all he wanted was Osama bin Laden and his fellow terrorists, that he would not interfere with the government, with the Taliban, with Afghanistan at all, if only the government would hand over these people. He made very clear that he had no desire for a war against the Taliban or against a religious regime. And it's only when the Taliban heads said, we are not going to give them over, we're protecting them, that they had no option, if, unless he were to back down, unless Bush were to back down and say, okay, I give up, which he couldn't do. They had no option there. But they certainly would never have picked a religious country if they weren't put in that position. Now, that doesn't mean... Okay, go ahead.
Can I just add on Afghanistan that I don't think we ever went to war with Afghanistan. We supported one side in a civil war, and I think we did that purposefully. We did not put hundreds of thousands of American troops in combat against a country ruled by a fundamentalist Islamic government. And they actually said this during the war, that we do not want to be perceived as fighting Islam. We do not want to be perceived as going to war against Islam. And as a consequence, we supported one group of Muslims, the Northern Alliance, against another group of Muslims, the Taliban, but it was definitely not all-out war.
Plus, the implication of my statement is not, therefore, he's willing to attack any secular country. He doesn't want to attack anybody. He just wants to get reelected the next time. So the problem is that he's got is where is the next catastrophe coming from and how can he avoid it or eke through it pragmatically. So they're talking about diplomatic means and conferences and negotiations with North Korea and who should be at the table talking to it. I mean, if you can conduct foreign policy with someone who's now more militarily armed, as far as I understand, than just about any other place in the world, and is totally hostile and run by a maniac, why in the world they don't simply go over there, the United States, and bomb out their nuclear facilities without conversation? And on top of that, stop humanitarian aid to the country so that the people will really starve and rebel against the dictator.
Next question.
First, a short statement. Thank you. Thank you very much. My question is, given that philosophy is the gatekeeper of a culture and religion can only enter and rear its ugly head when the leading intellectuals step aside, why no mention of the fact that Kant, Hegel, Nietzsche et al. Have been injected as much into the culture of the Middle East as was true in Germany in the 1920s?
I don't get.
Can you repeat that? I didn't get the question.
Well,
You mean Western philosophy is responsible for the corruption of Islam? Is that your point?
that's my point.
Well, I don't know that. I wouldn't be surprised because a lot of the Mideastern intellectuals have been educated in the West, and it's very probably true that the worst poison of all comes from Western universities, and that the way America, for instance, in the 19th century was ideologically basically destroyed by the fact that our graduate students used to go to Germany to study philosophy. and then come back here and take Kant and Hegel and all the rest of that German philosophy and infuse it into the arteries of American intellectual life. And I know of cases where they've gone from other countries, such as China, to the West, to France, for instance, been educated in the worst Kant, Hegel, Western ideas, and then taken it back home. So if that's your point, I have no dispute with that.
Well, let me add that I think there are two forces today in the Middle East. Really, two forces over the last 50 years in the Middle East. One is the force of militant Islam, which I think is strongly anchored in Islam, in religion. It has been inspired and helped along by certain Western ideologies. If you read about the Iranian Revolution, it's surprising how it was modeled very similar to the way the Russian Revolution was modeled. And they learned a lot from Lenin. They learned a lot from the left in Europe. But the other intellectual movement within the Arab world over the last 50 years has been nationalism. And that's Saddam Hussein, that's Bashir Assad in Syria, that's the Egyptian regime. And that nationalism is clearly, explicitly inspired by Western intellectuals. Indeed, the Ba'ath Party, which we hear a lot about these days, is modeled. Their charter is modeled after the Italian fascist party and somewhat after the Nazi party. Its intellectuals were almost all educated in the West, primarily in Berlin and in Paris during the 1920s, 30s. And so that the West has had, Western intellectuals have had an awful impact on the Middle East. Whether they've had an impact on militant Islam in its current variation, I'm doubtful. They don't need it. They've got enough inspiration in their own religious teaching to justify all the crazy things that they do. But it's definitely had an impact on the rest of the intellectual life, and it's prohibited a real alternative from arising in the Middle East. So what is there in the Middle East today that represents the West? Well, fascism. That is the only alternative, at least within Middle East intellectuals. Or in modern times, many of these intellectuals who've been studying in the U.S. over the last 20 or 30 years, the postmodernists, like Edward Said, thanks, at Columbia University, which is who is considered today in the Arab world the leading Arab intellectual, and he is, of course, a complete postmodernist.
Thank you.
Of course, also, both Hitler and Mussolini wrote columns for the Hearst papers during the time when William Randolph Hearst was considered the great leading light of the progressives. However, that's not my question. You have put forth the idea that basically Bush is acting as a complete pragmatist here, that his scope of ideology is the range of the moment. And this is the same message that the left has basically been saying. They've been trying to come up with a motive, the oil, the corporate empire, whatever, that fits their ideology. I wonder if you have considered the idea that Bush's actions, in fact, have been very, very consistent with promoting and sucking the world basically into an American-led world police system. And if you would comment on that, I think there is a great deal of evidence to support that, and I could name names and people that have been behind the scenes working for that.
You can look at the spectacle of the world today and say that what motivates it is a consistent attempt for America to dominate the world and be the police power that controls the world. You can observe the extent to which we have poured our money and our lives down the drain time after time to rescue other countries, altruistically, self-sacrificially, with no gain, going all the way back to World War II, going back to the Vietnam War, going back to Afghanistan, to the fact that we have the power. If that was our goal, why in the world haven't we already succeeded? Why do we have to do it through the back door? We have the troops right now to take any country in the world. We have the weapons right now to make the whole world cower. Why are we not doing it? If Bush has that as a motive, he has that power at his disposal. That is the most fantastic thing I ever heard.
I don't want to get into a debate.
Good. Next question.
Yeah, I was a little disturbed by how you're saying that the industrial war complex that we put together in World War II should be what we should use today. I don't think you gave sufficient insight to the advancements of our own weapons now to target directly the brain power or the leadership of these evil regimes, who really are not supported by their people, obviously, as we saw. Why can't, if we had these in World War II, we would have taken out Hitler, all his top people. The war would have been over in a matter of weeks, just like it was here.
Okay.
And we'd been done.
No, you take it.
I think it's insane to go with an industrial war like that when we don't need to.
Well, but that is insane, because that is not how indeed we fought the war in Iraq. As Dr. Peikoff mentioned in his talk, there were hundreds of targets that were taken off of the list because they had civilians close by. These were so-called leadership targets that were acquired in order to stop the war quickly. Many of American soldiers died because the helicopters had to get too close to the target. They couldn't fire from afar lest they might hit civilian targets.
Well, remember, we lost very few people.
What's that?
We lost very few people.
One person that you lose unnecessarily because you're trying to save civilian is a moral crime. It's treason to send one soldier. But let me add that when we bombed Dresden in World War II, when we flattened Dresden, we didn't do so because we needed to wipe out the whole city in order to get a few buildings that might have leadership targets in them. We flattened Dresden in order to break the will of the German people to fight.
Well, we didn't do it. That was the British. The British did that.
Let me finish. We did it. When we flattened Tokyo in the description of Dr. Peikoff, and by the way, that was one day. Within that week, they took out every German major city. They flattened it, killing tens of thousands of civilians. Not to hit a few leadership targets, not to hit a few generals by accident, but to break the will of the Japanese people to fight. That wasn't the British, that was the United States. And we were proud of it.
I just want to add one sentence. You cannot defeat an ideology by assassination. You would not have stopped Germany if you had killed, as they tried desperately to do, Hitler and Goebbels and Goering and the rest of the ones at the top. There were dozens and hundreds waiting to take their place. So you do not if you are fighting an enemy which has declared war on you in the name of an ideology, then the only thing you can do if you're fighting that country and defending yourself is to smash it. And that does not mean just any given leader, but the country. You have to break the will of the people to support that ideology. And it is not true.
What you're saying.
Excuse me. You made enough of a speech, and I was asked here to make a speech. It is not true that the majority of the people in a dictatorship are helplessly held hostage, and that if you only kill off Saddam, all the rest of the Iraqis are going to come out in the street and say, wonderful, we're now pro-American. On one day, many of them did. And if you read the papers now, you'll see that they are saying that America is just as bad as Hussein was. They want the Americans to get out. They think we're evil, we're pagan, we're infidels. And a lot of them are pining for the days of Saddam. They are saying, well, at least we had, one of our own as the head of the country and not these godless Americans. And this was true in Germany under Hitler. He had a dictatorship. Of course, he had a terrible dictatorship, but he had mass support for that dictatorship. If a dictatorship has no support in the country at all, how can it possibly keep its hold on the country? So your idea that the way to end wars is to kill the dictator and his henchmen is ridiculous, historically ridiculous.
Next question.
I think it's ridiculous to kill everybody who obviously does not support that
Next
dictator.
question.
It's like killing all Republicans
Next
because you don't
question.
support
We didn't come here to hear a
Democrats.
statement by you.
As you can probably tell, I'm a student, and I was just wondering if there's something that I can put my finger on and say that's brainwashing.
Yeah, did you ever have a professor say, well, something can be true for you but not for him? Or that nobody can be absolutely certain of anything? Or that we all see things from our own point of view and there's no such thing as objective truth? If you didn't hear any of that, or there's two sides to every story, you never heard any of those things in school. From grade 1 on, you must have gone to some kind of school system that I've never dreamed of.
IUSD.
You what?
IUSD.
I don't know what IUSD. Something San Diego. What?
Thanks.
UCI, is that what he said?
Irvine Unified School District.
Oh, well, I happen to know something about what's taught in, is it IUSD? Because I have a daughter who attends there. And I happen to see some of the things that her teachers are teaching her. And believe me, if you want to talk about brainwashing, I'll take a high school in Irvine as a perfect representative of what is going on in this whole country from kindergarten through PhD. If you want to know the details, I can give you chapter and verse on every subject. But it would be too horrifying after discussing our foreign policy to discuss the Irvine school system.
Yes.
Thank you very much for your speech and all the speeches you've been holding here. I don't know enough about Iran, but my one question is what are the ways Iran is promoting the militant Islam ideology that has become the monumental threat it has become today?
So the question is, what are the ways in which Iran is promoting militant Islam? Well, start out by teaching it. By teaching it at its own schools, but by exporting those teachings all over the world, using petrodollars, the dollars that they make off of selling oil. They have quite a pot there, and they start up schools around the world. They send out people to preach this ideology everywhere. According to the State Department, they're the #1 supporter of terrorism in the world today. So they fund it actively. And of course, since 1979, they have been advocating and preaching against the great Satan, America, and of course the little Satan, Israel, and advocating their total destruction. They are developing, I think a week before the war in Iraq started, they were showing on TV, they were showing aerial photographs of the nuclear weapons facilities that the Iranians have been developing. Not only that, but people have been in those weapons facilities and seen all that stuff that Saddam Hussein is supposedly maybe has. They've seen the Iranians have, and the Iranians don't deny it. And indeed, in speeches, they have said they will use it against both the Israelis and the United States. They have been actively promoting Al-Qaeda. People talk about Iranians as Shiites and the Al-Qaeda Sunnis, and that's a big deal. But the fact is that when it comes to hatred of the West and hatred of America, there is no difference between the Shiites and the Sunnis, and they cooperate perfectly, as is evident in the Palestinian Authority between the Islamic Jihad and the Hamas. One is Shiite, one is Sunni. They cooperate daily and coordinate their terror attacks. So does the Hezbollah with Al-Qaeda, even in spite of those differences. So Iran is everywhere, but most importantly, it is the only country, with a possible exception of Saudi Arabia, it is the only country in the world ruled by militant Islam, where the leadership from top to bottom is all militant Islam. They preach it, they fund it, they support terrorism. They are the #1 exporter of that ideology and the tool of terror in the world today.
Thank you.
Hi, I wanted to ask about Venezuela. As you know, there's a man down in Venezuela, I think his name is Chavez, trying to take over that country, maybe establish a communist dictatorship. Do you think it's morally right for the U.S. to intervene and put a stop to this?
To the extent of my knowledge of what's going on in Venezuela, the answer is yes. I think now the United States doesn't have to do much here because there is an active opposition. There's an amazing coalition in Venezuela of businessmen and of labor who all hate this guy and who are willing to go into the streets and oppose him, if only they're given the kind of support from countries like America that they need. Now, everybody says, but Chavez was elected democratically, and therefore he should be given free rein because he's a democratically elected president. Well, I don't believe in democracy if those are the kind of leaders that it elects. I don't believe in democracy per se. There's no constitution in Venezuela. He's clearly leading it towards communism. He's an ally of Fidel Castro. He's an ally of every regime, evil regime. Indeed, there's evidence that he's been involved, he's getting support from the Iranians for obvious reasons, because he's anti-American. And there's every legitimate reason to go after this guy and take him out, or at least to support. If we don't need to use American forces to support those in opposition to him and to take him out.
Dr. Peikoff, you touched a little bit about how state-sponsored initiatives, most notably the 6-month charade of going through the UN and recruiting countries for the Coalition of the Willing. You touched on that a little bit. I was curious how you would modify or refine the role of the State Department or diplomacy to combat terrorism.
How I would refine our State Department?
Or diplomacy in general.
Well, the first thing I would do is ask the UN to move to Switzerland and resign from the UN. The UN was a corrupt organization from its very inception, with Soviet Russia, the bloodiest dictatorship in history, as one of the charter members with veto power over the rest of the world, including the United States' action. It was an attempt by statists at the time to establish world government and destroy American sovereignty, which it's succeeding in doing. So I'd get rid of that altogether. I think you would then have to get rid of the State Department, or at least the upper echelons that make policy. Of course, it has to come from the president. But if you're asking how would I reshape diplomacy, it would have to be according to one principle. America's interests are first, and the only interest of this government is what advances America. Now, America does not succeed by conquest and never has. America requires only to be left alone. It is not injured by foreign dictatorships if we're strong because they're terrified of attacking us. Therefore, it is not our responsibility to save any dictatorship or the subjects of it around the world. It is our responsibility, in terms of our diplomacy and our purpose, to stay home, mind our own business, and have a tremendous military, so that if anybody dreams of attacking an American citizen or American interest here or abroad, in the 19th century, the way they kept peace for so many decades was what they called gunboat diplomacy. If some pipsqueak country anywhere touched a British citizen, the next day their gunboats were in the harbor, and they left Britain totally alone. That was British diplomacy. Of course, when they became socialists, they gave it up, and look where they are now as part of our coalition. That is all diplomacy is, and that's all it has to be. No, we don't need alliances. None of our allies are of any use to us. All we need is the will to defend ourselves, and no one would even attack us. It's fantastic for Americans to wonder how to treat the rest of the world. It's up to the rest of the world to wonder how to treat us.
Gentlemen, basically, is war nothing more than a question of economics, the haves versus the have-nots, and they just hate us because they're jealous of our lifestyle?
No, I don't think they're jealous of our lifestyle. I really think that's paying the fundamentalists much too high a compliment. If they wanted wealth and happiness and success, they would emulate the causes that we emulated and that the whole West did. They despise riches, science, happiness, and every important secular Western value. They want to destroy it. Now, what I said before remains true. They're not consistent. But within the limits of that that survival requires, if they're going to stay alive at all, they want us to die. They don't want themselves to prosper. And so you're giving them much too high a compliment to say it's just the have-nots against the haves. It is the have-nots, but they want it to be the have-nots against the have-nots, and all of us should have nothing. Then that's a much worse, that's a nihilist attitude, not an envy one.
Just to quote one of Osama bin Laden's ideologues right after September 11th, he said explicitly, just as they, Americans, love life, we love death.
Dr. Peikoff, I'm an officer in the U.S. Navy, and however, I'd like to talk about the Navy inside. I see a problem with the Navy that has a socialistic atmosphere. I would equate it to the factory in Atlas, each according to his need, each according to his ability. So, wondering if you had any insight on how to inject a little bit of capitalism inside the military.
I don't know the inside of military life at all, but I have heard that it's very bureaucratic, not just the Navy, but the whole military. But I'm not in an objective position to judge because I have no first-hand knowledge. And there's a lot of anti-military sentiment in the country. So I don't know to what extent those statements that I've heard are true and to what extent is propaganda. Now, you're testifying that from your experience it's true. I can understand that to some extent there's going to be bureaucracy in any government undertaking, but maybe you have more.
Right, there's no question that the military has been impacted by the corruption of the culture in general. The military has not stayed immune from that, and the fact that so many military officers support this beware of shooting at civilians ideas that are being fed down from the top suggests that there's been some real corruption even within the ranks of the military. And I know, for example, there's a lot of politically correctness today in the military. You're smiling. You cannot have a military, and I support the military completely, particularly at the time like this. But you cannot have a military that's immune from the culture. The military is going to be infected by whatever bad ideas are common in the culture. So the only way to improve the military, the only way to change the military for the better, and I do agree that it needs changing, is to change the culture. There are no shortcuts here. I don't think you can start at the military and go outwards. You're going to have to change the culture, and that'll trickle into the military and make the change. And I think the change will be easier in the military because I think, at least on an emotional level, the members of the armed forces are more open to rational ideas and to pro-American ideas.
I just remember one thing that is in favor of your question. There was a story about an admiral on the deck of one of the big ships addressing all the sailors, and his essential point, this is just before the war on Iraq, was that what we are there for is one mission, and that is to enable the Iraqis to have freedom of worship. That was his speech, and according to the news reports, the sailors looked skeptical. I mean, the only freedom they had in Iraq was freedom of worship. Hussein didn't care.
Let me, on the other hand, say that, as you said, the sailors looked skeptical. And I was watching, the interviews of some of the American soldiers before the war in Iraq, and they were being asked, do you know why you're fighting, what you're fighting for? And I think a lot of them were very eloquent and very good about explaining that they were fighting so that their children didn't have to deal with monsters like Saddam Hussein, that there was a real threat to the United States. And they were taking a very selfish approach to why they were fighting. And my heart went out to them because I knew that they were being given battle orders that were not going to protect them. In spite of their own selfishness, we as a country were not fighting a selfish war. And that's the tragedy. That is the real tragedy. And the more corrupt the military forces within become, the more tragic it becomes because the more soldiers are going to be sacrificed on the altar of these horrible ideas.
Thank you.
Thank you for your speech, Dr. Peikoff. to use your word, I find it fantastic, especially post 9/11, that our troops are securing the borders of virtually every other country in the world but our own. And I was wondering if you had anything to say about what our policy should be on. I mean, we have this Department of Homeland Security, the biggest bureaucracy in history.
Oh, that.
And well, but how can you have a Homeland Security without protecting the borders? It's fantastic.
I think I had a whole section in my speech, but it was overlong, unfortunately, on the Department of Homeland Security. You cannot secure your homeland against terrorists if you don't destroy them in their native countries. How can you possibly, even if you had them completely, all the borders completely ringed, you cannot prevent, an occasional person, that's all they need, from getting it with smallpox germs and letting it loose, in a crowded mall. That's all you need. You just need a few maniacs. It is ridiculous to have airport security the way it is. There is no way in the world to have as many flights as we do across a whole continent and find every lethal weapon on every passenger. It is really ridiculous. To say nothing of the fact that we're not allowed to, quote, use ethnic profiling. So young Middle Eastern men, you can't discriminate against them. For every one of them that you x-ray, you have to x-ray one nun and one retired admiral and 2 members of Women's Lib. It has to be equal rights for all suspects. Otherwise, it's racism. Now, I mean, the whole thing is so fantastic and so pointless. There was one good senator in Florida. What's his name? Graham? And he said that, in effect, he made a very good statement that the only way to ensure domestic security is to destroy terrorists where they are bred and live. Once they get here, you're not going to stop.
Not only that, but the idea of Homeland Security, the idea of having a permanent cabinet position for Homeland Security, basically tells the American people that we're in this forever. This is the biggest restructuring of the American government since the Great Depression. This tells the American people, this is it. Terrorism is a fact of life. Get used to it. And with regard to the other part of your question, I think it was a part of your question, bringing all the troops home and putting them on the border with Canada is not the solution. I don't want them protecting any borders. I want them crossing borders. I want them going out and killing terrorists. That's what they should be doing. That's the only way. No country has ever defended itself on the defense. You cannot win wars on the defense. You cannot win wars by building walls or fences like the Israelis want to do. The only way to win a war is to smash your enemy and defeat them thoroughly.
Yes, my question is, first I was born and raised in Iran, so when you mentioned Iran, got my undivided attention. My question is, why big corporations, oil companies, don't stop buying oil from Iran and break Iranian government economically rather than bombing the country? I mean, don't you think that's a better way to deal with the situation?
Well, let me say that we've had sanctions against Iraq for 12 years. Millions of people in Iraq. Let me just, I know the questions about Iran. We've had economic sanctions against Iraq for 12 years. Millions of Iraqi people, including children, have been dying of starvation because of Saddam Hussein forced these sanctions, right? And did that stop Saddam Hussein? Did it stop him from finding ways to sell stuff so he could make money to fund terrorism and to build weapons of mass destruction? So economic sanctions do not work by themselves. These governments will still, if they have this ideology, will still promote terrorism around the world. Now, I would support oil companies not buying oil from Iran. For that matter, anybody, not buying anything from Iran, and indeed America doesn't. American oil companies are prohibited from buying oil from Iran. The French still do. The Russians not only trade with Iran, but they build their nuclear power plants. They're helping them develop their nuclear capabilities. The rest of Europe trades with them. So the Iranians are enriching themselves by selling oil into the world markets through other sources, and I don't think there's any way to stop them in that way. The only way to stop this regime is by eliminating it, either through supporting the student revolution within Iran or militarily by using American force.
I just want to say there is, this last thing that Yaron said is important. There is a real serious opposition within Iran. And if we would support it in every kind of way, economically, diplomatically, and morally, I think that there would be a good chance, and I'm not an expert at all in this field, but I think there would be a good chance of fomenting a revolution in Iran that would make a war unnecessary. My only point is this: if there is no way of doing it peacefully, because I'm not a strategist, if there is no way of avoiding war and overthrowing the Ayatollah regime, then we are morally obligated, not just that we have a right, we are obligated to bomb Tehran until that country submits, until we break the back of that enemy. I'm not bloodthirsty. If there's a way of doing it without a war, that's fine. But I don't know.
Thank you for your time tonight. I was given the assumption that there are two methods of motivation boiled down to its simplest forms, the carrot and the stick. And religious fundamentalism abroad that embraces, like you said, we embrace death. Obviously, they need the stick. There's no carrot for someone like that. I'm afraid, though, that in this country, we are facing a rise of religious fundamentalism ourselves. And we can't use the stick on our own citizens without an amazing amount of backlash and causing the problem to become worse. So what can we give to our own people as a carrot instead of a stick?
Well, you gave a very eloquent speech. It's my speech condensed into a couple of minutes. As what incentive can you give to the American public to hold different ideas? I mean, a public doesn't originate ideas. Ideas are originated by intellectuals and basically by philosophers. You can trace the whole state of the culture back to certain key philosophers, such as, for instance, Kant. I wrote a whole book on how Kant is responsible for the state of the world today. So there's nothing that we can do, that anybody can do, to hold up to the public and say, here's the reward, because the public is following, as the public in every country throughout history necessarily follows the intellectual leadership. So we have to have a new philosophy. That's what we're trying to do, but it's very hard to even get the public to hear a philosophy, because most of them don't know what philosophy is. They take it for granted as obvious, and there's only a very small number of people that even will listen to a philosophy. So you start small, and you have to just try to grow. It's a very long, drawn-out procedure.
Yes.
Thanks tonight for your talk, Dr. Peikoff, and the whole series. In Dr. Brooks' talk last lecture, he expressed a full-hearted support of the war against Iraq, and it seemed tonight you've repeated you seem to have criticized the war with Iraq, albeit with reservations. I was wondering...
Wait. I criticized it with, what were my reservations?
More with the way it was conducted, it seemed, than the actual... It seemed like your primary focus, though, was you were against the war. Well,
I'm trying to think what I said last time that gave you the impression that I was... the talk was before the war started. And I said...
That's not correct.
Or was it after the war started?
yes,
Anyway,
sir.
let me tell you what my position is. Hopefully it's consistent with what I said last week. I think it is. I believe that Iraq is better than nothing. That is, faced with alternative and not doing anything or fighting a war in Iraq, we should fight a war in Iraq. We should have fought a war in Iraq, and we did. I think the way we fought it, I agree completely with Dr. Peikoff, and I think I mentioned it last time, that I think we fought it in a weak manner, at least up until the last few days in Baghdad, where we showed some strength. So I agree completely with Dr. Peikoff's criticism of the war in Iraq, and I mentioned in my speech last time a number of times that the real target in this war has to be Iran, and I mentioned Saudi Arabia as well, as the heart, as the two countries that represent militant Islam, who preach it, who export it, who fund it, and that they have to be the targets short-term, long-term, but they have to be the targets, and as soon as possible, because every day that we wait, they're funding more terrorist activity against us. Now, we might evade some of it here and there, but ultimately, they are funding it, and some of it will be successful.
I just want to add this. If you are starving and your choice is to eat the worms on the street, on the road, or die, then certainly it's better to eat the worms. But if there's a banquet down the block and you insist on eating the worms, there's something wrong with you.
So you are supporting the war, Dr. Peikoff?
Yes, I'm in favor of eating worms.
Okay, my other question was, I do agree with your primary focus on this being a difference in ideology and religion being the root of evil, but would you agree that we have some culpability, given our past actions of instilling the Shah in Iran and the Ba'ath Party in Iraq to support our short-term oil interests, and also Bush's current focus, references to God, and also our past cooperation with Iraq, Iran, Pakistan, etc.?
There's no question that American foreign policy over the last 50 years has been abysmal. And to the extent that we have supported horrific regimes in Saudi Arabia and in Iraq and so on, I think that has emboldened those countries and the terrorists to come and strike against us. And to the extent that in the 1940s and 50s and 60s, we did not stand up and protect our property rights, when those were stolen from us, when the oil was nationalized by Iran and then Iraq and then Saudi Arabia and these other countries, and instead put in place these dictators and somehow to protect our oil interests is ridiculous. The only way to protect our oil interest was to protect them, and that is to use military force to protect the property rights of American, British, and French companies during the 1950s and 60s. And when we retreated from that, yes, we set the stage for these countries to come after us because we showed our weakness. And then not to mention the whole list, which I've done in other talks, the whole list of terrorist attacks against the United States, and we did nothing. We sat and did nothing. So our weakness, our pathetic weakness, and our pragmatism in supporting Osama bin Laden against the Soviets and Saddam Hussein against the Iranians, and then the Iranians, with the arms for hostage or whatever it was, our pragmatism, short-term supporting for ideologies that are so filled with hatred against us and clear enemies of us has come back to haunt us. But it's not too late for us to do something about that. And we shouldn't say, as I think many libertarians say, we shouldn't say, oh, we've sinned in the past, therefore we need a leave foreign policy and we need to come home and we need to build walls around the country. That's not the solution. The solution is to undo the damage that we did 50 years ago and go in there and make things right.
Agreed, but just briefly, Bush again references God and befriending Pakistan and...
Okay, we have like 5 minutes and I've got 3 other people there. These are going to be the last 3 questions.
Gentlemen, wherever you live in the world, you live under a political and economic system. In the Middle East, what political and economic system would you propose that would be most effective? Ones that Washington can somewhat embrace and hopefully can clear up and hopefully make people, especially over there.
There's only one proper political system for any country in history or today, anywhere on the face of the globe, and that is a system that respects and is based on the individual rights of life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness. In other words, it has to be the way America was founded. It has to be laissez-faire capitalism, and nothing else for any people, anywhere, at any time is proper.
We have a monster in North Korea who is as vicious as Saddam Hussein, who has done more harm to 22 million people in North Korea. But we have an administration insists on going through the diplomatic solution. Is Dr. Peikoff, is your position is a military solution?
Yeah, didn't I say it already? I think we should just do and militarily just bomb their facilities, the nuclear facilities, out of existence and starve the country by cutting off humanitarian aid and foment a rebellion against them. That's it. I don't think anything else is necessary. I don't, do you?
No, I think the solution to North Korea is military. There's no question about it. And indeed, we've had, I think the first hints of a nuclear weapons program in North Korea were in the 70s. And since the early 1970s, we've been negotiating with the North Koreans to solve this problem. And they have promised on at least half a dozen times not to develop any more weapons ever again.
With a 10 million
So the only solution in the 70s, as today, is to bomb their facilities out of existence and to threaten. I think the only way to do this is to threaten the use of tactical nukes in order to prevent them crossing into Seoul and taking over South Korea.
with a 10 million military force on the borderline, I mean, in the border, wouldn't that create the bloodbath, north and south?
No, because as I said, the United States should threaten and then, if necessary, use whatever it has in its arsenal in order to prevent that without damaging Seoul. And I think that's doable, and I think the threat would be enough. There's no doubt that we could stop them if we wanted and if we were willing to use the kind of force that is available to us. But if we say certain weapons are off the table, we're only going to kill generals, we're not going to kill soldiers because they're innocent, they're forced into the army, we're not going to kill civilians, and of course then they'll overrun South Korea and it'll be a bloodbath. But if we out front from the beginning say any movement of troops will basically involve the annihilation of the capital city of North Korea with one bomb, and that's it, I don't think they'll move.
If they thought we meant it.
If they believe we meant it, and maybe we'd have to show them we meant it, which is doable too.
I wonder if your opinions on when the U.S. should engage in preemptive war have changed in the face of new weapons like anthrax. Shouldn't we engage in more preemptive wars sooner? And for example, the moment an anti-U.S. dictator begins manufacturing anthrax or begins acquiring it, shouldn't we attack as soon as possible?
I would say that we have to establish a policy that the rest of the world understands that we are going to retaliate massively. And if they believe it, I think that 98% of the dictators would never come near us and would lock up any potential perpetrators out of fear. There is no way we can go around the world and take out every country that has weapons or means of destruction that could be used against us. And there's no reason why we should assume that risk and that kind of military burden and expense, and it's not necessary. What we have to do is establish in the world the fear of the rest of the world that Britain had in the 19th century, as I've said. And if you establish that, you do not have to go around and weed out the dictators. They pluck themselves out of fear of what's going to be done to them.
Yeah, I think that we need to establish some criteria that says if you are going to use this any weapon against us, and it doesn't really matter. I mean, this whole discussion of weapons of mass destruction is, to me, a little ridiculous. You know, it's okay to kill people with a 20,000-pound bomb, which is about the size, almost the size of the atomic bomb in Hiroshima and Nagasaki in terms of its devastation power. But if it's an atomic bomb, it's not okay somehow. The criteria is if they have weapons that are going to be used against the United States, any weapons, then they're history. And that's it. And you establish that criteria and you show a few examples, as I think we need to do today, and I think that they'll go away and they'll disappear. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Peikoff.